We're now going to walk through the implementation of the first part of the ZippyQuotes server. And in particular, we're going to look at the connection management portion of the server. And you can find that at the link at the bottom of the slide in the EX1 project in my RSocket folder in my Live Lessons GitHub repository. So we're now in the project for the RSocket example EX1, and we're going to start by taking a look at the connection management portions of this. So this is over in the source main folder, and you can see we have the Zippy Connect controller, which is a controller. It's got a service, and just like we looked at before, it's got an endpoint that's a connect mapping endpoint, and that's where the client is going to route the request to connect to the server. You don't have to have a connect mapping if you don't want. It's only if you want to do things like authentication, which of course is what we're going to do. So let's take a look at the interesting part, which is the service implementation. As you can see here, the service has got this concurrent hash map that keeps a mapping of the name the client uses, which is encoded as a UUID string, and the RSocket requester that the client sent over that corresponds to the client. So that's what we're going to keep a map with. Here's the handle connect method. This, of course, is a hook method that's called back by the underlying controller when it gets an incoming connect message. And what we're going to do is we're going to handle client status changes first, and then we're going to finalize connection setup. So let's take a look at handle client status changes first. You'll notice that this takes the requester the client sent us. That's how we talk back to the client, and the identity that the client is using for itself, which comes across as something called a payload. So let's take a look first at how do we handle client status changes. So this is pretty cool. We take the client requester, this is how we get back to the client, and we extract its underlying RSocket. So now we can do lower level calls. And then we say on close, here's what I want you to do. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to print out a diagnostic message saying we've received a connection from the given client. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to add the client's identity and the client requester into this connected clients map. So that's the very first thing we do. We store it away to the side. Then if something is to go wrong at some point, we indicate client's closed down for whatever reason, but we don't actually remove the client from the map because that will be handled in the do finally method here. That's the last thing that happens. And the last thing that happens here is we print that we're being disconnected from the client, and then we take that thing out of the map. And then we take that whole little flux, or sorry, it's a mono stream, not a flux stream, a mono stream, and we subscribe to it, which will start this processing running in the background. So this processing will now be running in the background, and the whole thing will take place asynchronously until we close down. The second thing we do in the connection establishment phase is we call finalize connection setup. And what this does is this goes ahead and it takes the client requester. We got the requester from the client, so we can talk back to the client. And we say to the client, hey, I'm going to reply to you and let you know that I'm set up now, that we're connected, that we're buddies, we're pals. And so it's going back to the client's endpoint. The client has an endpoint called server response, and it's going to get notified. We're going to send back some data saying the connection's accepted, I'm all ready to go. And then we're going to go ahead and send a request back to the client. So this travels back to the client. So now we're the server acting in the role of the requester, sending a request to the client. And then the client is going to respond with an acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement will come back as a string, and we print out that string. And then we trigger all these things to occur asynchronously as well. So that's all the stuff that's taking place on the server side of things. You'll notice just a couple other things I'll mention briefly here. We've got the RSocket security config file. And this particular file has the strategies for being able to do authentication of users. And this is using a very simple mechanism that you probably wouldn't want to use in production systems because you wouldn't want to send things that are, just simple passwords and so on. But for the purposes of this example, I have a very simple authentication mechanism where I register some users like myself with my user password. That is not my password, by the way. It's a very clever pun with Gandalf at the bridge of Khazak Doom. And so these are the ways that you can set up authentication and authorization mechanisms. And All this stuff was documented courtesy of ChatGPT, and I double-checked it to make sure it was correct. But if you use this type of file, you can set up the authentication mechanisms. And when we look at the client side, you'll see how this all gets initiated. So that's basically what we've got here. We've also got some constants saying what port we're listening at and what endpoints we have for the various endpoints, like the server connect endpoint and the various messaging endpoints and so on and so forth. The rest of the stuff we'll talk about when we get into the discussion of the message passing part of the server implementation.